The library was supposed to be quiet, until she whispered my name when no one else was around. The first time he noticed her, the library was quiet in that sacred way only old buildings with tall, dusty shelves can be, where each footstep echoes softly against polished wood floors, and the faint scent of aging paper hangs like a memory. He had come in for a simple errand, to find a book he'd been meaning to read, expecting nothing more than the solace of familiar rows and titles. But then he saw her. She moved with a kind of effortless grace, a quiet authority that didn't demand attention but naturally drew it. She was in her early 40s, with a posture that suggested confidence tempered by warmth, her dark hair falling in soft waves past her shoulders. There was a calm in her gaze, the kind that made the edges of the world seem a little less sharp, and he caught himself watching, noticing the subtle way she tucked a stray strand behind her ear as she leaned over a desk. Their first interaction was brief. A polite greeting as he approached the circulation desk, the brush of her hand against his as she handed him a library card. It was fleeting, almost accidental, yet electric, a spark that lingered longer than either dared to acknowledge. Her voice was low, careful, and somehow intimate, even in the public space of the library. Each word, though mundane, carried a softness that made him listen more intently than necessary. He found himself returning the next day, and the day after, drawn not by the books alone but by the anticipation of seeing her. The small moments, her smile when he asked about a title, the way her eyes briefly met his before glancing down at the desk, began to carve their way into his thoughts. Even the smallest gestures mattered, the way she adjusted a stack of books, the quiet hum of her laughter when a patron asked a silly question, the tilt of her head as she concentrated on a catalogue. In the background, the library itself seemed to conspire in these first encounters. Sunlight poured through tall windows, dust motes dancing in the air, highlighting the curve of her cheek as she turned to scan a shelf. The rustle of pages became a subtle symphony around him, marking time that he had suddenly grown eager to stretch. He noticed details he hadn't before, the warmth in her expression when she smiled, the slight hesitation in her movements as if she, too, was aware of the unspoken pull. By the end of that first week, he was acutely aware that his visits were no longer about the books alone. Each glance, each shared word, each accidental touch carried a weight that made the quiet library feel alive, charged with possibility. He didn't know where this connection would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt the quiet thrill of anticipation, like a story unfolding page by page, and he was desperate to see what came next. He began to linger in the library longer, finding excuses to be there after the initial reason for his visits had passed. The air seemed softer when she was around, as if the quiet itself adjusted to accommodate her presence. At first, their conversations were brief and functional, questions about a book, directions to a certain shelf, but slowly, they began to stretch beyond necessity. He noticed the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about literature, the way her fingers lightly traced the edge of a page as she explained a plot point, as though the books themselves were extensions of her thoughts. One rainy afternoon, the library was nearly empty, the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows creating a private cocoon. He found her in the corner, seated at a small table, a novel open before her. She looked up when he approached, her expression a mixture of curiosity and quiet welcome. They started talking, first about the book he had picked up, then about the authors they loved, memories of childhood libraries, and the comfort of familiar stories. Their voices were low, blending with the soft rustle of pages and the occasional creak of the wooden floor, creating a world that seemed theirs alone. There were small, accidental touches that began to linger in his memory. When reaching for the same book, their hands brushed, and neither withdrew immediately. A smile passed between them, subtle and knowing, unspoken acknowledgement of the spark that had begun to grow. He noticed how she leaned slightly closer when sharing a story, as if inviting him into her space without breaking the unspoken rule of decorum. Her laughter was soft but genuine, a warmth that lingered in his chest long after it faded into the library air. He started to anticipate these moments, savoring them with the careful attention of someone afraid to rush what was unfolding. Every glance, every brush of fingers, every tilt of her head toward him felt intentional yet unforced, like the slow turning of pages in a book you cannot put down. In these shared moments, he felt a quiet connection deepening, an understanding that was both fragile and exhilarating. By the end of the week, their conversations had begun to touch on personal matters, favorite childhood memories, small regrets, fleeting joys. There was an ease that surprised him, a feeling that he could speak and be heard without judgment, and he realized that he was beginning to treasure her company not just for her beauty or charm, but for the warmth of her mind and the subtle intimacy of their growing friendship. The library, with its quiet corners and golden light, had become a stage for a delicate dance of emotions, each step unspoken but deeply felt, a prelude to something he didn't yet have the words to name. By now, his visits to the library had become less about books and more about her presence. The initial thrill of noticing her had transformed into a gentle, almost comforting rhythm, the quiet companionship that only grows when two people begin to understand each other without speaking too much. He found himself seeking her out, not for a specific reason, but simply to be near the warmth she exuded. One late afternoon, the library was nearly empty, the golden sunlight filtering through the high windows casting long shadows across the wooden floors. She was perched on a ladder, reaching for a book on the top shelf. He stepped closer, offering a hand to steady her. For a brief moment, their hands touched, fingers brushing lightly. Neither pulled away, and the simple contact seemed to hum quietly in the space between them. He felt the faint pulse of her wrist beneath his fingers and the reassuring steadiness of her presence beside him. They began to talk more openly. She asked about his day, his thoughts, even small worries he hadn't shared with anyone else. He realized that her interest was genuine, and in the comfort of her attentive listening, he found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't before. Their conversations flowed naturally, punctuated by quiet laughter and thoughtful pauses, as if the library itself had slowed down to match their pace. Physical proximity became easier, almost instinctive. Sitting side by side at a table, he noticed how her shoulder would sometimes brush his, a gentle reminder of her closeness. When reaching for the same book, their fingers would linger near each other, and he caught himself savoring the brief warmth of their touch. Even when silent, her presence felt like a comforting anchor, steadying him in ways he didn't fully understand. There were also moments of unspoken reassurance. A hand on his back as he bent to pick up a fallen book, a light touch on his arm when laughing at a shared joke, the quiet steadiness of her gaze when he expressed doubt or frustration. These gestures, small yet profound, created a sense of trust and safety that deepened the emotional bond between them. As he left the library that evening, he carried with him the soft weight of their shared moments, the comfort of proximity, the ease of conversation, and the subtle intimacy of gestures that spoke louder than words. He realized that these interactions were no longer fleeting, they were shaping the way he thought about connection, about closeness, and about the delicate line between friendship and something deeper. The library had become a space not just for books, but for a slow, tender unfolding of trust and quiet affection that neither of them could ignore. The unspoken tension between them had grown steadily, like a quiet undercurrent beneath the calm surface of the library. He found himself acutely aware of her presence even before he saw her, her soft footsteps along the aisles, the gentle rustle of her cardigan as she moved between shelves. The air seemed charged when she was near, and he noticed the way his chest tightened at the smallest gestures, the tilt of her head, the curve of her smile, the way her eyes held his gaze just a fraction longer than polite. One evening, after the library had emptied and the echo of the front door clicking shut faded into silence, he lingered in his usual corner, pretending to read. He felt rather than heard her approach, the quiet shift of her weight a signal that she was there. Their eyes met across the narrow space between stacks, and in that glance, 1,000 unspoken words seemed to pass. Neither spoke, the silence itself carried the weight of confession. Their hands brushed accidentally while reaching for the same book, and this time, neither moved away. The warmth of her skin against his lingered, drawing his breath into an almost imperceptible pause. His heart pounded, yet there was a calmness in her touch that reassured him, it was steady, familiar, and charged with a quiet intimacy. For the first time, he realized that the line between friendship and something deeper was no longer invisible. They exchanged few words that evening, but each was deliberate. Her voice, soft and low, seemed to resonate more closely with him in the empty library. A smile curved her lips when he hesitated over a comment, acknowledging the mutual awareness that something was unfolding between them. She did not rush him, nor did he try to rush himself. They allowed the silence to speak, letting the tension stretch and thrum in the space between them. He noticed how she shifted slightly closer as she leaned to set a book down on the table, her shoulder grazing his. The brush was light, almost casual, yet it carried a weight he could not ignore. He caught the faint pulse of her wrist beneath the fabric of her sleeve, a subtle signal of life and warmth that mirrored his own. It was intimate, yet entirely safe, a confession without words, a promise without obligation. As he left that evening, he carried the memory of that brush of hands and the quiet electricity it sparked. The library felt different now, more alive, imbued with the unspoken acknowledgement of attraction and longing. He understood that the real story was no longer in the books around him, but in the delicate, magnetic tension between them, a slow, unfolding connection that demanded patience, awareness, and the courage to face what neither had yet said aloud. Over the weeks, the library had become more than a place of books. It had quietly transformed into a space where he could exist fully, and where she could share pieces of herself he hadn't yet seen. Their conversations, once casual and brief, had grown intimate in the gentlest of ways. She began to let him in, speaking of moments that mattered to her, carefully peeling away layers of quiet confidence to reveal vulnerability beneath. One late afternoon, sunlight streamed through the high windows, pooling across the worn wooden floor and illuminating the library's dust-speckled air. He found her seated at the usual table, a cup of tea steaming beside her, a stack of novels he had recommended close at hand. As he approached, she looked up and smiled, a soft, welcoming smile that made him feel at once noticed and at ease. They talked, first about the books scattered before them, then about life outside the library, her regrets, small triumphs, and memories that shaped who she was today. He listened intently, careful not to interrupt, letting the cadence of her words wrap around him like a warm, steady blanket. Physical proximity had become more natural. Sitting side by side at the table, he noticed how her hand would occasionally brush his as she reached for a book, lingering ever so slightly. When she leaned over to show him a passage, her hair fell lightly across his shoulder, and the warmth of her presence pressed against him in a way that was intimate but entirely safe. Each gesture carried meaning, comfort, trust, and a quiet, unspoken acknowledgement of their growing connection. She spoke softly of past disappointments and moments of longing, and he responded with empathy, offering thoughtful observations rather than advice. The ease of their dialogue created a rare intimacy, one that felt grounded in mutual respect and understanding. He realized he had begun to crave these conversations not just for her stories, but for the way she made him feel seen and valued, as though every word he spoke mattered. A shared laugh over a playful anecdote drew them closer physically, her shoulder brushing his, her hand briefly resting near his own. The subtle warmth of touch combined with the soft intimacy of conversation created a profound sense of safety, a cocoon where vulnerability was welcomed rather than feared. As he walked home that evening, he carried the quiet weight of their connection, a sense that something significant was taking root between them. The library had become a sanctuary not just for learning, but for trust, closeness, and subtle, growing affection. Each shared story, each fleeting touch, was a thread weaving them together, slowly transforming curiosity and admiration into a bond neither could deny nor yet fully name. The library seemed to shrink around them, as if the world beyond its walls had softened into insignificance. They were alone that evening, the usual hush of the space deeper than ever, punctuated only by the occasional creak of a wooden floorboard or the faint flutter of pages turning. He felt the subtle charge of anticipation as she moved closer, the warmth of her presence pressing gently against his awareness. It happened in a quiet corner of the library where sunlight lingered through tall windows, dust motes floating lazily in the golden glow. They were bent over a large, open book, examining a passage together. Her hair fell across his shoulder, brushing his arm lightly. He didn't pull away, and she didn't either. It was a simple contact, but electric in its simplicity, an unspoken acknowledgement that something had shifted between them. Then, in a voice so soft he had to lean in to hear it, she whispered, quiet, but not when we're alone." There was a playful undertone in her words, yet it carried a sincerity that made his pulse skip. It was a confession without confession, a delicate invitation wrapped in the guise of a joke. The tension that had been building over weeks, the unspoken glances, lingering touches, and shared moments of vulnerability, suddenly had a name, even if they weren't ready to speak it aloud fully. He noticed the way her fingers lingered near his on the table, the subtle tilt of her head, the warmth radiating from her shoulder brushing his. Their eyes met, holding each other's gaze longer than was necessary, the quiet around them amplifying the intensity of the moment. Every small gesture, the brush of her hand, the lean of her body closer, carried layers of meaning, desire, trust, curiosity, and care, all intertwined in the simplest of touches. Words became almost unnecessary. Silence stretched comfortably between them, filled with understanding and the thrill of shared intimacy. His chest tightened in anticipation and warmth, and he felt a profound connection, one that went beyond attraction, beyond curiosity, an intimacy of spirit and heart. As the evening drew on, he realized that this moment had changed everything. The library was no longer just a place of study and solitude, it was a private world where boundaries softened, where playful confessions and lingering touches could speak volumes. Their bond, built slowly over weeks of quiet companionship and gentle vulnerability, had reached a peak that neither could ignore. It was a moment of unspoken promise, a delicate step towards something deeper, something neither of them had named but both already felt in full. The library had become their sanctuary, a quiet refuge where the world outside ceased to matter and their connection could breathe freely. The slow burn of weeks, the subtle touches, the whispered confessions, and the shared silences had built something delicate yet undeniable. By now, they had learned to navigate the unspoken rules of their relationship, the quiet respect for the library's decorum, balanced with the freedom to explore closeness in private moments. That evening, sunlight spilled through the tall windows, casting soft shadows across the wooden floor and highlighting the dust motes that danced lazily in the air. They were seated side by side at their favorite corner table, a stack of books between them. Their shoulders brushed occasionally, and each brush carried the warmth of familiarity, trust, and a deep affection that neither of them had rushed. Every glance, every fleeting touch, felt purposeful yet effortless. He reached to point out a passage in one of the books, and their fingers brushed. Unlike before, there was no hesitation this time. Her hand lingered lightly over his, a gentle acknowledgement of the bond that had grown between them. She tilted her head slightly, eyes soft, and a small smile played across her lips. It was a silent conversation, rich with meaning, gratitude, curiosity, comfort, and desire all intertwined. They spoke quietly, sharing thoughts, memories, and reflections. Laughter occasionally broke the soft rhythm, the sound warm and genuine, filling the empty corners of the library with life. In these private moments, their connection felt complete, not rushed, not forced, but natural and deeply satisfying. It was as though the weeks of small gestures, shared confidences, and subtle intimacy had built a foundation unshakable in its quiet strength. At one point, she leaned slightly against him, and he felt the steady beat of her presence against his side. He rested his hand over hers, their fingers entwining naturally. There was no need for grand declarations or dramatic gestures, their affection spoke through the simplicity of touch, through the comfort of being present together. The warmth between them was steady and reassuring, a quiet joy that needed no words to affirm itself. As the day faded into evening, he realized that the story they had been writing together, the story of shared moments, gentle touches, and whispered confessions, had reached a place of contentment. The library was no longer just a building filled with books, it was a vessel for their bond, a testament to patience, respect, and the beauty of slow, deliberate love. They stayed there, side by side, smiling softly, hands brushing, hearts quietly in sync, knowing that the connection they had nurtured would continue to grow in its own time, tender, profound, and fully theirs. If this quiet, slow-burn romance captured your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, and check the link in the description for the full story.